An interesting development in other places in Europe that is sort of heading the different direction than the English experience. We just looked at the English experience, which essentially is limiting the power of the monarch, limiting the power of the traditional church, and limiting the power of traditional noble classes. We are not talking democracy yet, let's not go there, but they are eliminating some of the conditions that are keeping democracy from happening or larger republican thought. After the time period of 1648, there will be much more development in England of those ideas. But let's take a look at two other places that are seemingly going the opposite direction. The continuation of that hardcore, one person's in charge absolutism, and one will be France and the other is Russia. Now, we had introduced the Cardinal Richelieu earlier. Now, Cardinal Richelieu is going to be the religious leader, all right, of France, and here's a quick depiction of him. And he will be in charge of French foreign policy for about 20 years or so until his death in 1642. He's the one, for example, that gives massive amounts of money to Gustavus Adolphus, the Lutheran Swedish king, to kill German Roman Catholics when Cardinal Richelieu also works for the Catholic Church. But like we said in the 30 Years' War, things change a lot, and the idea of political power becomes more interesting than religious power. But what Cardinal Richelieu also does is he is behind a couple of other key developments. He is starting to create a better system of taxation and able to prosecute the war on a larger level, more armies, more navies, more ability to pay for them. He also has what's called the intendant system, and what that is instead of just relying on local officials to do what the king says they should do, and then just trusting that they're doing it, he creates a system where relatively low-level bureaucrats are continually sent out to other places in France to double-check on issues of loyalty and authority and taxation and justice. In other words, central power is being exerted out to the local areas and then reported back to the king in Paris and followed up upon. It is tending towards absolutism, tending towards more concrete centralized control. In that process, by relying on lower-level bureaucrats, he's taking away much of the power of the traditional nobility. He cannot steal their property from them, but he can take away some of their prestige and some of their connections to the royal family, and they have less opportunities to sort of shine in terms of being bureaucrats or military officers. Okay? He also increasingly is working on how, as a politician, he should juggle competing interests, that he shouldn't rely just on religion as the way he's going to organize his culture or his society. He's also going to use other factors. And then he's also going to be, and this is the time period we want to talk about, the emerging economic system called mercantilism. It is a state-driven form of economics where instead of relying on entrepreneurs, there is this idea that the state will control many things and they will use different monopoly practices to control the economy. And when something needs to be done, for example, in France or Russia, the government might set up, say, create a gunpowder factory instead of waiting for entrepreneurs. There's a different sense of how to run the economy. Mercantilism also has a theory about hoarding gold and silver, creating overseas colonies, and in many ways, it's a very interesting state-driven economic system that is in many ways opposed to and undermines consumerism. And later on, as we look into the later part of European development, we'll get back to the ideas of, say, Adam Smith in the 18th century about free markets and laissez-faire and essentially what's going to be called capitalism. For now, though, the economic system that's prevailing is called mercantilism, and it is a process of enriching the state and in many ways not allowing the consumer to run the economy. Another area of Europe, and this is again on the edge, is the development of absolutism in what was modern-day Russia. Now, Russia had experienced a series of difficult expansions. They had, remember, finally gotten rid of the Golden Horde, the Mongols. Moscow had been the major collection point for taxes by the Mongols. There's even one famous Russian prince named Ivan Moneybags. I think we know what he was doing in terms of collecting taxes. But the idea here is that Moscow was and continued to be a center of power, especially economic power and taxation. Once they expel and get rid of a significant amount of control from the Mongols, Moscow now is able to assert itself as a major power. And there's an area of society, this is a picture here of Ivan the Terrible, who was the Russian Tsar up until the late part of the 16th century. He was known for being very brutal and if not outright mentally unstable. But when he died, it set off a time period called the Time of Troubles in Russia, a 15-year period or so up until the year 1613, when the Russians are finally able, after a series of military battles, to expel all the Polish invaders who had come in and taken over Moscow. And there was a great difficulty between the Eastern Orthodox Russians and the Roman Catholic Poles. It's a long animosity that in many ways continues to this day. But what they also did was they were able to select a new family. The family of the Romanovs is chosen now as the Tsar, the leader. Tsar is a corruption of the word Caesar. Remember, Moscow came at one point to be the third Rome when Byzantium fell apart. Here's that example. We're now talking about the Tsar, the Caesar. The inheritor of the Roman tradition now is in Moscow and is going to be leading the new Roman Empire, at least the way it's thought of. What's also happening is that the Russians are successful militarily in expanding out towards the Baltic Sea, north towards the White Sea and towards the Arctic, and then also taking over large chunks of territory that used to be controlled by the Mongols in what you know as modern-day Siberia, and they continue to expand outwards towards the south. They are still a landlocked empire for the most part at this juncture, but they are growing in military strength. They're on the edge of the Ottoman Empire, and they're on the edge of the European empires of the Holy Roman Emperors and the Teutonic Knights and others like that. And what we're having here is the creation of a large Russian state that is not connected to the West by tradition, not the same Reformation, not the same Renaissance, not even the same alphabet. But the Russian experience and expansion will continue as we move forward and eventually lead to the creation of a very united and very powerful Russian state. But first they have to overcome the looks of this guy. He does look very scary, doesn't he? Take a look at this time of troubles development era of the Russians up until 1613. Also take a look at the time period of Cardinal Richelieu and his control of France in the 1630s and 40s, and note the way in which each of them is building towards a dynamic, centralized, absolutist state where the monarch is going to have a hyper-concentration of power. Also see if there's some sample questions that can help you address this area.